tonight, the second in our series of In Conversation With. And tonight I am delighted, it's a real privilege to have with us Kate Humble. Now, I'm sure that Kate is well known to you all. She's a writer, broadcaster, a very familiar face on our TV screens, hosting shows such as Springwatch. But Kate, if I was to read your whole CV and go through it, all the credits you have, we'll be here all night. So I'm going to read out what it says on your Instagram account, or how you describe yourself, which I think is walker, talker, traveler, storyteller, happier outdoors than in. Is that right?
Well, that's what I wrote.
Well, I'm sorry to bring you indoors tonight, but thank you very much for being with us. As I said, it's a real privilege to have you here with us.
Well, it's tonight of all nights is quite a good night to be indoors. It's not very pretty out there. I'm looking as dishevelled as well as usual, but looking as dishevelled.
We'd expect nothing less, but thank you for being here. Walking, if I may, I think it was in 2019, you wrote a book, Thinking on My Feet, and it was shortlisted for a Wainwright Prize. Can you tell us a bit about it? Where did you walk? Was it just here in the UK?
It was so it was a book. It was a bit of a departure. It was the first book that I wrote for a different publisher, and it was, I'd written books that were a bit more, I suppose, about taking on a farm, and I'd written a book about the extraordinary relationship between humans and dogs, and then I wanted to write something that kind of summed up how I feel about being connected to the countryside. And the best way for me to have that feeling of connection is on my feet, is through walking. And I moved to, I'm very lucky because I do live in one of the most beautiful areas to walk in the UK. And I don't think I'm that biased. I think there would be other people who would agree with me, even if they don't live in the Wye Valley. But I live in the Wye Valley on the borders of England and Wales, on the Welsh side. And for me, one of the things, oddly, you mentioned Springwatch. When I started doing Springwatch, I was living in London. And one of the things that I kind of riled against, having been a country girl and having been brought up in the countryside, was the fact that when you live in a city, the kind of natural order of things, seasons as are weirdly skewed, and and I really missed those kind of early signs that tell you how a season is shifting. So if you go for a walk at the moment, even on a wet, windy, horrible day like today, the snowdrops are starting to come out. You're starting to hear different birds in the woods because they're starting to go. So I heard my first great spotted woodpecker drumming this afternoon over the rain. And that's the thing I loved about walking, and I wanted to try and encapsulate that in a book. And the book is mainly UK walks, but not exclusively. And one of the things, I actually opened the book with walks that I did in a small town, a small border town in Tanzania, or in Kenya, but on the border with Tanzania, called Isibanya. And I was there making a very, very difficult, very rewarding documentary about this particular tribe and about the practices that they still do, even though one of them is illegal.
We might come onto that in a bit.
Yeah. But I walked around that town every morning before we started filming or before we went anywhere. And for me, it gave me a sense of connection, and it gave me a sense of belonging. We were staying in a very tiny, not a sort of tourist hotel. It's not a tourist area. I stood out a mile as, a very obvious not local. But by walking kind of became sort of more accepted as a local, and I would go and I'd see all the same, people selling their donuts or people selling their chips in my eye or whatever it was every morning. And so people got to kind of recognize that I was there, and it just made me feel more immersed in that community. And you can't get that any other way, I don't think, unless you're on foot. So the book was, yeah, was a celebration of the power of walking and also the incredible benefits that I get, and I know lots of other people do, kind of mentally. Just, it helps order your brain. It sometimes, it can calm you. It can, it's magic and it's free.
I totally agree with a group of friends or two different groups. We walk now in different parts of the UK and we absolutely love it. It's sort of life affirming in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
I know another walk that you've done recently or a couple of years ago was the Pico Trail in Sri Lanka. It's
Yeah.
300 kilometers long, but I'm not sure you did the whole thing. You did various stages, didn't you?
I did, yeah. It was so the Pico Trail is a really interesting idea. It was set up by an incredible man, a Spanish guy who's lived and worked in Sri Lanka for a long time. And one of the things that he understood, he was in the tourism industry, and one of the things that he understood was that, Sri Lanka, for all its diversity and beauty, still has very much these kind of hot spots of tourism. And, even though visitor numbers have dropped significantly because of COVID, because of wars, for all sorts of reasons, you still, and I found it when I was there 2 years ago, you go to the places that everyone goes to. You go to the places that everyone has posted on their social media, and it feels like they're overrun. And this means that the benefits from tourism tends to be quite localized, and there are whole swathes of the country that don't see any benefit from tourism. And so this guy thought, hang on a second, how can we do tourism better? How can we be more sort of democratic? How can we encourage people to go to other parts of the country where there may not be, kind of great attractions as such, but they're still wonderful? And he was a big walker. And, Sri Lanka is punishingly hot at the coast, but actually up on the hills in the tea plantations, it's much a much kinder climate. And so he, along with loads of kind of local guides, I mean, it was an extraordinary labor of love. It took him 12 years, kind of put together this, as you say, 300-kilometer trail that runs from sort of between two hotspots, so from Kandy to Ella. And it's not really finished, and they're trying to get funding, but it's there. You can do it, and on things like Wikilocs, you can read the route. It's not, very little of it is actually officially marked. Some of it is, but I loved it. It was just, again, it was that whole different view of a country. Suddenly, you were seeing the things that just felt more local. You were going into small villages, and you could buy stuff in little local shops, and you felt much more connected with the country, with the people. And there were days that we'd walk all day and not see a single soul. It was a really beautiful thing, and I really hope that the trail kind of sustains somehow. It's one of those things, you can have a brilliant idea, but even
It's
even
not.
brilliant ideas need money. Need money.
It's not something I've done, but I know that a few of our clients have done, like you, parts of it, and we totally endorse it. And everything you say about sort of helping local communities, going away from the hotspots as well, that's all so relevant.
Mm.
Um, Given that we are a specialist travel company, I want to take you back a little, if I can, and talk about some of your early travels. I know that at an early age you sort of Eurorailed around Europe, but I want to take you to Africa because when we've
Mm.
spoken in the past, you talked a bit about going to Madagascar. I think it was in 1994, was it?
95, actually. It was just at the
95, sorry.
beginning of
So you're still in
95.
your teens, late teens then maybe, yeah.
So sweet. Um, I was quite young, but not in my teens. So I had this obsession with Africa, and I don't really know where it came from because, when and I think most people my age, so let's just be frank. So I was born in 1968, so I grew up in the 70s, and um, we as a family, and I've and most of my contemporaries didn't go on foreign holidays. You just didn't. You did. There wasn't the money. It just wasn't part of the kind of culture, really. When we went on holiday, we went to a holiday cottage somewhere in the UK, and mum just cooked in a different kitchen. It was quite grim for her. Really. So as you said, my really the first time I went abroad, more or less, was when I went Eurorailing after my O levels. And I was so untraveled, I actually had one of those cardboard passports from the post office. I didn't have a proper passport. So yeah, but I was always, I loved travel writing. I loved people like Dervla Murphy and a lot of women, actually, Christina Dodwell, people like that who really made me sort of see the world in a way that I hoped one day I might experience. And Africa, something about the continent, something about the way people wrote about it just entranced me. And I went there. Actually, the first time I went there was in 1989, and I spent a year, and I was on my own. I was 19. I was a teenager then, and and it was formative. I mean, that's all I could talk to you for hours and hours about it, but it was an absolutely formative experience. It it gave me my obsession for wildlife. It gave me an unbelievable respect for people who have so little and yet are impossibly generous and live in ways that, we could only wish to emulate. It made me see some real hardships, but just real beauty. It's a continent of such contrast, and it pulls your emotions in every direction. And so when the elections happened in 1994, I had to go back. I was married. I've always been self-employed, so I've never, as my mum said, had a proper job. So I was earning kind of practically nothing. My husband and I had our first mortgage. He's also freelance. I mean, the whole thing was to suddenly go, let's just go to Africa for I don't know how long, was a madness, but we did it because that's what you do when you're in your early 20s. And Madagascar was absolutely at the front of my mind, and that was definitely Dervla Murphy's fault. That was definitely Christina Dodwell's fault. It was definitely a writer called Helena Drysdale's fault. I'd read about this extraordinary island, about the unique wildlife, about the incredible cultures and traditions, and the mysteries around the island, and the fact that you could still find giant eggs of extinct birds. I mean, it was just like, I've got to go there. And we did spend a year in mainly in the southern part of Africa, and then were offered a job back in the UK, and we had 2 months before we had to come back, and we just sold everything. We had an old Bucky, an old Ford Cortina Bucky. We sold everything and just went, right, let's just go and spend that last 2 months in Madagascar. And it was extraordinary. I mean, we only saw the kind of southern half of the island. So we flew into Tana. We walked. It took us 9 days to get to the Zingi de Bemera, which I will never forget. I'll never forget the journey there. I'll never forget being there. We were in a truck to go. There was no, I mean, you just had to walk, or we took ox carts. We ended up in a truck going through that iconic avenue of baobabs, and we were just on it was public transport. It was just this giant lorry with a guy with a blunderbuss who was the driver, who would occasionally drive into the woods and just fire off this blunderbuss, and then the two boys who packed the luggage would run out and go and pick up all the guinea fowl that he'd shot, and then we'd all just camp. The whole bus would, or the whole truck would just camp and cook guinea fowl. I mean, it was incredible. And
did you write about it at the time, or have you
well,
written about it since?
I did. It was actually that journey. I mean, I never thought I could be a travel writer. Yeah, I just, that was for other people. But I came back having had this extraordinary experience, and I was introduced to a woman who I just don't think I've ever thanked enough, but she was the travel editor of the Telegraph at the time, a woman called Jill Charlton.
Yeah,
And many people in the travel industry know Jill, as they should. And she I don't know why she did, but she kind of took me under her wing, and she taught me how to write an article. She also got me terribly drunk which it took me like a week to recover from. But she was interested in me writing about Madagascar, and she just let me write. She didn't say I need 1,500 words she said just go and write it. And I think I sent her something like 6,000 words. And for the lovely people listening to this, your average travel article is 1,500 words, maybe 2,000. And I think I sent her about 6,000, and she helped me edit it, and then she published it. It got front page of the Telegraph in 1997, I think, or 1996. Anyway, and yeah, that was the first article that I ever wrote, and my first published writing. It was incredible. I remember Ludo, my husband, really sweetly going to the little corner shop at the end of our road in Shepherd's Bush, and I think he bought every copy.
I was going to say, you bought all of the copies. Exactly. Yeah. Have you been back to Madagascar since? I presume you might have.
I haven't.
Right.
And
do you want to go back, or do you want to keep that memory as it was, or do you want to?
That's the thing. I don't know. I know, I know it's changed tremendously. I know obviously there's a lot more tourism there. There's whole swathes, of course, of the island that we didn't see.
Yeah.
So
if you do want to go back, I know a good tour operator who might be able to help you with that. So,
do you? Okay, yeah. If you could give me their number after this, that would be great.
Okay. So some 5 years after Madagascar, I think you were in Western Sahara. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you spent some 35 days or doing
Mali. I was in Mali.
Mali, yeah.
So you see, my other obsession was sort of travel writers, but my other obsession is trade routes and old trade routes. And a lot of the books that I read or sought out were about those, whether it was the Silk Road and somehow I'd read about this salt route that crossed the Sahara, and Timbuktu was involved. And Timbuktu is one of those place names that you think, is it real, or is it just the wonderful kind of product of somebody's vivid imagination? And for some reason, this salt route Timbuktu thing stuck in my head, and it wouldn't go away. And and this is sort of pre-internet. You couldn't just kind of go on the internet and go, oh, can you go to Timbuktu and do a salt route? So I started doing a load of research about it, and found out that there was a route, and it seemed to still be active. And to cut a very long story short, I ended up just getting myself to Timbuktu and meeting. I'd been in touch with an aid agency that was working there, and the woman at the aid agency had then put me in touch with a local guide, and he thought we just wanted to go out into the desert. And I said, well, no, I actually want to do this whole route. Anyway, fate, in the wonderful way that it does, sort of intervened, and I ended up traveling with this extraordinary 3 men. They became like my family, really. Rahman, Brahim, and Salik. And we traveled 1,500 kilometers through the Sahara to a place called Taudeni. It's not really a place, but the mine called Taudeni, which is just out of Algerian border, yeah. And I'm back with camels. I had a very beautiful white camel called Duncan. I called him Duncan.
Why Duncan?
Because he looked like a director. Maybe you don't have to go into that. No, he looked like a director. I worked with a director when I was working on Animal Hospital as a researcher. Our director was called Duncan, and he was grey-haired, in a, prematurely grey, but in a very, in a rather dashing sort of way. And he had very long eyelashes. And my camel was white with very long eyelashes. So he just reminded me of Duncan.
Was Duncan happy that a camel was named after him or not? Anyway.
Do you know, funnily enough, I bumped into him not that long ago, and I told him I don't think he was that impressed.
Okay. And did you document that travel, that 1,500?
No, I never. I mean, I've got notes and photographs, but I never wrote about it.
Okay. Oh well, not least at that time, obviously Mali is not somewhere you can travel to, but I've been there to Timbuktu, Mopti as well, and Bamako I think was one of the only places I've actually danced in. I love the music there in Bamako. Um,
It's an
it's a
extraordinary country.
place, yeah,
It's just desperate what's happened
yeah.
there.
I want to take you to another route, another trail that you've done, which is the frankincense one. Uh, that was you started in Oman, did you, or
Yeah,
yeah?
it started in Oman. So this was actually it was a Fertelli trail. Um, but the idea was that of a wonderful man called Mohammed, who I met in Petra. Mohammed, sadly, the late Mohammed, was married to a friend of mine, an incredible New Zealander called Marguerite, who traveled to Petra or traveled to Jordan. Um, in the 70s and met Mohammed in Petra and they fell in love. And it's one of those things that people would go, oh gosh, that would never last. And they were married until he died and they had their children. They lived in a cave in Petra until all the Bedouin were moved out. And we stayed with them. And it was Mohammed who told me about the frankincense trail. I told him I was doing the salt route. And he went, oh, that's for wimps. Anyone can do that. And I was thinking, well, I think it's going to be quite
That's
tough,
for Duncan.
actually.
Leave that to Duncan.
Yeah. He said you should do the frankincense trail, and I said, well, what's that? And he said, it was the trade route that frankincense was carried from the land of Punt to Gaza, and I said, oh, and so where does it go? And he said, well, we think probably the land of Punt is now Oman, what's known as Oman, and it would go through Yemen and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Israel and finish in Palestine. And I said, well, there's no chance I'd be allowed to do that. I can't get into Saudi Arabia. This was 2000 well, no, this was the late 90s. We were talking about this. And he said, we'll dress you up as a Bedouin and no one will know. Anyway, again, like the
Well, it's
salt
an
route, it
yeah.
was one of those things that stuck in my head. And in the mid noughties, someone at the BBC said, what's the journey you would really like to do? And I said, I'd like to do that one. And amazingly, I mean, it took 2 years to set up, and get permissions to get into Saudi. But I carried a sack of frankincense from Salalah in Oman and took it to the Christmas Eve service in Bethlehem and traveled overland all the way through. And I think of what's happened to that region, what is happening to that region now, but and it makes you realize how incredibly dynamic our world is in some good ways and some bad ways. But I was so lucky to go to Yemen when I did. I was so lucky to actually see Saudi. Saudi's changing, lots of people are going to Saudi now, but to see it, I'm really pleased that I have the context of seeing it at that time. And one of the things that I realized was just how extraordinary, again, the hospitality in those regions are. And I had a moment when we were filming in Saudi, we were filming in Jeddah. And there's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful man who's known as Engineer Sammy, and he's an architect, he's an art collector. I mean, he is basically kind of the king of conserving Jeddah, ancient Jeddah, and some of the ancient buildings. And in fact, friends of mine who've been there since and made documentaries there since have worked with Engineer Sammy. He is he's really the king of Jeddah. And he said, and he's just wonderfully enthusiastic and fabulous. And he said, when we got there, he said, Kate, you must come. We must go to the merchant's house. And he said, and we have to hurry. We have to hurry. We have to get to the roof on time. And I know really what he was talking about. Anyway, we race up through this house. And as we're running up, it's 7 stories. And as we're running up it, and he's saying, this is the oldest building in Jeddah. And he's telling me all about it. But he said, it's more important we get to the roof. We get to the roof. And we got up to the roof. And Jeddah, old Jeddah, is a bit like, if anyone has been to Zanzibar town, it's this wonderful kind of snaking routes of cobbled streets and tiny little, shack stalls all along it, and then the mosques, and it's beautiful. And we got up onto the roof, and you're looking down, with this incredible kind of bird's eye view of the old part of the city. And he said, I wanted you to be here now because there are 26 mosques in Jeddah. And he said the imams here, they're very competitive. So no one has
The Azan,
recorded
the call to
calls to
prayer.
prayer.
Yeah,
They all do it themselves. And he said, I want you to hear it. I want you to experience it. And we're standing and the sun is starting to go down and everyone, you can hear the kind of shutters slapping as the shutters close, and you're seeing all these figures, like little ants kind of running through the streets towards the mosque, and the sun is going down, the sky is huge, and then suddenly you hear this Allah and it comes in this sort of Mexican wave of sound across the city. It was one of the most beautiful things I have ever experienced. And there's this man who is being so poetic about it. And I lost it, Justin. I was absolutely in floods of tears. And for some reason, it ended up on YouTube, or so, I don't know how these things happen. But I started getting messages from people all over the Middle East saying, you get it. And
yeah,
I
you
thought,
understand.
gosh, sometimes telly can do a good job.
Yeah, yeah. You talked about the kindness of strangers, which I'm a big believer in. And some in my travels, I've been so privileged and lucky to, yeah, just come across people who always look after you. But how was your your disguise, sorry, your Bedouin disguise? And how was it traveling through Saudi as a woman?
Um, I was not disguised as a Berber,
Okay,
but I did dress appropriately. And actually, I was in Yemen before I went into Saudi, and I had the most wonderful woman who was sort of my fixer and translator in Yemen. And Yemen then was slightly more relaxed. I mean, as a Muslim woman, she covered her skin, so she wore long sleeves and long trousers. She didn't cover her hair always. But in Sana'a, in the capital, it was a bit more
you did.
traditional. So
Yeah.
she covered up. Um, and I said to her, I'm going to Saudi. What do I have to wear? And she said, right, we're going to go shopping. And she took me to a shop where I could buy an abaya, so the
Yeah.
long black robe sort of thing that you wear. I mean, it's a little bit, she said you wear it a little bit like a dressing gown, so you can wear anything you like underneath. She said, sometimes I've gone out, you wouldn't believe what I'm wearing underneath. Um, but so you wear that over the top. She bought me a scarf. She actually did buy me a burqa as well. She said, just in case, and
Yeah.
she dressed me up. And it was one of those extraordinary things. So as she said, right, now you need to look at yourself in the mirror. And it's like you're looking at a human cutout. You've kind of gone. It was a very, very odd experience. Um, and actually, when I was in Saudi, I never wore the burqa. I never was completely covered. I always covered my hair, although I was very bad at tying this or keeping the scarf on. It kept falling off. And sometimes funnily enough, it would often be the women who would be sort of crosser with me, or perhaps they were being protective. But,
Yeah.
I would have sometimes old women coming up and, kind of
Full.
wrapping this scarf sort of around me, making sure that it wouldn't fall off. Um, but I found Saudi then, again, you know, there were things that as a woman and as a woman growing up not in that culture, I found very difficult. I found it extraordinary that a woman wasn't allowed to drive a car. I found it, frankly insulting that I would go into a restaurant and I wouldn't be able to eat with in the same area as my male colleagues. And that sort of thing. But it was not my place also to say this is wrong. You know, and if you are it's very, very difficult. If you're traveling in somebody else's country and with somebody else's rules, however much you feel that they are wrong, they need to be respected. And I felt that I was respected as a guest. I was absolutely looked after. I went into royal households, and I went to, it's an absolute fallacy that everyone in Saudi Arabia is rich. They are absolutely not. There's a huge, huge disparity.
I'd agree with
And
that.
I went to some of the poorest communities in Saudi Arabia, um, and and I found it, as I say, there were things that rankled my kind of feminist sensibilities, but in general, I felt very welcomed, very looked after, and very privileged to be there.
What about in Afghanistan? You were there in about 2009, but I think you were largely in the Wakhan corridor, which is up in the northeast, you used the word relaxed about some parts of Yemen. I think
Yeah.
it's more relaxed there.
Yeah, so I first went to Afghanistan in 2009 rather, and it was the Wakhan. And actually, we went in through Tajikistan. So I didn't go into the rest of Afghanistan at all.
Yeah.
And the
So you didn't go
Wakhan
to Kabul then at all?
not
No,
then.
not then. No.
I went back. So yeah, 2009 I went in, and oh my goodness, that that part of the world, I mean, you can't, it's almost indescribable. Everything, I mean, the scale of the Pamir Mountains, and the Wakhan Corridor is a high altitude valley. You know, the valley floor is at 3,500 meters, and then it's got peaks of over 5,000, 6,000 meters all around it. It's an extraordinary place for anyone to live. I mean, it's classed as desert because there's no rainfall there. So the communities, the Waki people who live along the length of the valley, they are absolute masters of irrigation, and what they're irrigating is the runoff from glaciers. And in the summer months, they move their livestock up into the mountains. So they have a sort of a transhuman and migration route where they take their sheep up into the mountains over the summer, so that the tiny areas that they can basically cultivate, they'll grow as much as they possibly can, so that they can survive the very long winters. I mean, the winters are basically 9 months long. They're the most extraordinary people. I mean, it's hard, I loved it. And it's hard not to romanticize their lives, but there is nothing really romantic about a life where your life expectancy is 35. And there was almost nothing there, no infrastructure there at all. But again, I mean, the hospitality of all of them, and I loved them. I loved the area. It's so beautiful. And you walk, as I did. I was sort of wrecking a trekking route basically, and at one point we had two wonderful guides, one called Gorgali and the other one called Armin Beg, and we were walking up this very, very steep slope, and it was sort of sandy-ish or kind of dusty soil, and there was this big paw print in the soil. And I said to Gorgali, and his English wasn't good, and my Waki is non-existent. I said, what animal is this? And to me, it looked like a cat, but I didn't want to think, oh, could I be walking in the footprints of a snow leopard? And he said it's a wolf, and I went, it's definitely not a wolf. Dog, wolves, you'd see the claws. Yeah. And it was just it was a cat. Anyway, I took a photograph of it. I then met a snow leopard scientist later, and I had indeed been walking in the footsteps of a snow leopard, which was just amazing. And I went back. I mean, I just loved it. And actually, I did a documentary that allowed me to go back to that region in 2012. And at that point, Tajikistan was too tricky to go through. So we did actually go in via Kabul, which was eye-opening. Absolutely desperate. If anyone wants to read a really brilliant sort of history of Kabul, read Liset's latest book, The Finest Hotel.
Yes.
Oh, it's so good. Good. It's so Very good. And it just encapsulates so humanly the trauma that country and those people have been through.
There's also an excellent book by Jason Elliott. It's not the Land of the Shining Light or something like that, but by Jason Elliott on Afghanistan, because I was there in September and I found it equally fascinating. It's some of the best travels that I've been lucky enough to do for a while.
And so where did you go?
I basically came in from the Khyber Pass in Pakistan and went through north, so Kabul, Bamiyan, and then Mazar Sharif, and then into Tajikistan, and then along the Wakhan corridor, but on the Tajik side.
The Tajik side.
But
And
my guide was from the Wakhan corridor, and he's saying, look, you've got to go back. And he was such a lovely man. Anyway, I will
okay,
go
well
back.
let's
But
organize it. But
well, let's
how
do that. But I've got another trip to talk to you about in a minute that we should do together. But
okay.
you mentioned snow leopard, and I think it'd be remiss of me for listeners want to talk, maybe hear from you about a bit about nature and your love of nature and wildlife. Have you seen a snow leopard? Have you? No?
No,
Okay,
but
that's another trip we can do together. Okay.
it is literally so I have been having conversations in the last week. It's very, very high on my list. So yeah, there's some scientists that I know who work with them, and yeah, we're plotting. We're plotting.
Good.
But the thing about snow leopards, and it's actually a really interesting point because um, you know, you don't, anyone trying to see a snow leopard and expecting that it will be like seeing a lion in the Masai Mara is going to be very, very disappointed. First of all, you're in a landscape that is, you know, incredibly hostile and difficult to move around in, and an animal can disappear like that.
But
Um,
part of the joy is the thrill of the chase, understanding the environment and the landscape that that animal inhabits.
ab Absolutely. And there is literally no guarantee that you're going to see one. So I think I think I will have to go, and people who you have to go with a mindset of I'm not going to see it. What I'm going to do though is have that frisson of excitement of being in its territory on its terms. And if I get a glimpse of it, if somebody, I mean, you can get scopes now where you can see something a kilometer away, and that's the reality. That's probably as close as you're going to get. Um, but for me, I mean, as I say, even walking in the footsteps of one was incredibly exciting. And the other thing that, we have to remember when we go to uh, really wild environments like that and the territory of snow leopards is the territory of other extraordinary creatures. There are bears, there are wolves. You have the chance of seeing any number of things. So to have your sight set on only one creature is madness, because you just miss out on so many other things. And you would miss out on just, wilderness is so rare. Places where people have not imposed everything are so rare. And for me, I think the joy, if I do ever get into snow leopard territory, is that this is not a land of people. This is a land of wildlife.
I think that's such a good point about immersing yourself in an area region. For instance, on safari, I think some of it's become too passive, and that you can, if you go on a walking safari, you won't see as much, but you learn so much more. The understanding you get from it, and I know that you're a big believer in that, in that people need to experience and understand and create empathy, and in doing so, once we know about something, we can protect something more.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I think it's tricky because people could say uh, to me, and they would be absolutely right. I have been extraordinarily lucky. I've had the great privilege in my working life and for pleasure to have had a lot of opportunity to see wildlife. If I said I'd only done one, I was only going to do one safari in my life, would I want to try and see all the hard hitters, the superstars? Of course I would. Of course I would. So I think perhaps, I have come to this mindset the, through the luck of having had a lot of time in Africa, or in places where people go to see wildlife. And and one of the things that I've realized is that if your experience is simply one of being in, a vehicle, driving out, seeing a lion, tick, seeing a leopard, tick, seeing elephant, seeing rhino, whatever it is, and then whizzing back for your sundowners and a gin and tonic might look good on social media. Um, but that isn't Africa. That isn't a wildlife experience. Now, it is not up to me to dictate what everybody's wildlife experience should be. But what I hope is that, you know, I can help encourage people to explore other ways of experiencing, wildlife, the African bush that isn't that very prescriptive and, as you say, passive um, experience of being in in an African national park. Um, and at least if people know that there are other options, they can take them, and don't think that the only way to go and experience African wildlife or Asian wildlife or whatever it is, or go to the Pantanal or the Amazon is in that very kind of tick the box, get the photo, go home way.
I think that's exactly right. I also think that we don't talk enough about local communities on safari, on travel. I think before we came on screen, we were talking a little bit about sort of human wildlife conflict in different parts. And you earlier, when we've been on screen, you mentioned Tanzania and walking around with communities. You're going, is it in April, to Botswana, to the Delta, and you're doing an ultra marathon. But again, it's about trying to get support for local communities in the area. Do you want to
Yeah, so
say something about
it's a local mound-based tour operator in Botswana, and the founder James Wilson is somebody who again really strongly believes that travel needs to benefit more than just the people traveling, and but also by by supporting communities, by travel basically helping with local education or training programs or whatever it might be, or helping raise the standard of living by employing local people, whatever it might be, that also benefits the traveler. We don't miss out or somehow have a worse experience by doing something that actually is more beneficial to local communities. And I would argue, and I know you would too, that actually it enriches every travel experience. And Botswana is rightly famous for its delta, for the incredible wildlife experiences that people can have there. It was one of the very, very first places that I went to, actually as a driver for a safari when I was a teenager. And it is extraordinary. And people go and they spend a lot of money there. But James wanted to find another way of people being able to experience the Delta. He's a runner, and he thought maybe, and you mentioned walking safaris, and that's one thing, but maybe he thought maybe I could put together, something kind of really extraordinary and different. And it took him a year, him and his team, and working with their local communities to say, could we do something that's safe, but is going to give people a very different view and very different experience of the Delta. So he's never done this before. I'm going to be on the inaugural trip at the beginning of April, and it's a 100-kilometer run or hike, split over 3 days. I've no idea whether I'm going to collapse on
are
day
you
one.
raising money? Are you raising money?
No, it is,
Well,
it is,
well,
it is,
maybe you
as I
should, and
say,
and have a link, and we can all sponsor you in different ways. So
I see now, Justin, I'm one of those people who I just don't think people should have to pay me to do something I want to do, and I should just, if I want to give money, I will.
okay, that's very, very good and noble. Um, you talked about snow leopard being elusive. I know that you lead trips to go and see the mountain gorillas and the chimpanzees. Certainly, the mountain gorillas are a little bit easier to see because they live in a great big salad bowl. They don't move every day. Chimps are arboreal. They kind of move, but again, in the morning, it's one of those things when you hear them pan hooting. But I want to take you to the eastern lowland gorilla. You went to Kuzi Biega near Bukavu in the Congo, one of my favorite places. Would you tell us a bit about that and the difference between the
Oh,
eastern lowland gorilla and the mountain gorilla, maybe?
well, so there is a wonderful man who some people may be aware of. He's called John Kahekwa. Um, and he was born on the edge of Cohesi-Bahega National Park in the Congo. And his family were actually very much involved in the park in the early days of the park when it was established, when it was first established. John is a remarkable scientist, a biologist. As I say, people may have heard of him because he was shortlisted for an Earthshot Prize for his work. And he established something called the Pole Pole Foundation for his community because his village that's right on the edge of the park, it is very poor. There are very few opportunities for anyone to make any sort of living. And so for many families, they would go into the national park either to cut trees, to build houses, or for timber for cooking. And they would put snares, not to catch gorilla, but to catch meat for the pot. These are not big scale poachers. They're poaching to help their families survive. But if they got caught, and they usually did, they would be fined or imprisoned, and they just didn't have the money. And if they were imprisoned, it meant that, a key member of the family who could support the rest of the family was out of the loop. So John set up the Poli Poli Foundation to come up with ways that that community could support itself without impacting on the park. And it's a brilliant organization if anyone wants to look it up. It's Pole Pole, but Pole Pole, slowly,
Yeah.
slowly in Swahili. Um, and John, one of the things that he really wanted to do was to try and bring back tourism. The Congo obviously has had its more than its fair share of strife in recent times. And so he reached out to me and said, would I come? Would I see, you know, would I come and experience it and maybe write about it? And so I went. I went in through Rwanda, met him in Rwanda on the border, and we crossed over the bridge into the Congo together. It was, I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, there is nothing comfortable about traveling in the Congo, but you don't go for comfort. I mean, it's a remarkable place, and John's village, to go there and visit it with him and to understand what the Poli Poli Foundation is doing, and to actually really understand the impact of tourism done well. Me being there, the tiny contribution that I could make, still, I could see the impact that it could have if more of us went there. And then to go to Kahuza-Bahega, and I'd seen Western lowland gorillas before because I've worked with Western lowland gorillas and, the mountain gorillas, but I'd never seen an Eastern lowland gorilla. And there are 4 subspecies of gorilla, and the Eastern is the biggest. And you think, well, a gorilla, if you see a gorilla up close, it's an extraordinarily powerful, dynamic creature. So I sort of thought, how different can a gorilla be? Anyway, we trekked out with these remarkable trackers and rangers who, most of them haven't been paid for most of their lives, but they are so dedicated to looking after these creatures. I mean, the men in that park were, as I say, they're right up there with my biggest heroes of all. We trekked out, and suddenly, and we were in this bamboo forest, and they'd said they're in the bamboo forest at this time of year, this is where they like to hang out. We trekked through, and suddenly we started seeing basically big piles of poo and bits of chewed up, bamboo. And John's going, gorilla's been here having its breakfast. And you're thinking, my goodness, where is it? Where is it? And suddenly he went, did you hear that? And I was like, no. And he went, listen, listen. And you could just hear very faintly. And I was like, oh my God. And all the hairs on the back of your neck, and they're standing up on the back of my neck now, just remembering it. And we walked on, we were being really, really quiet. And then suddenly one of the rangers at the front said, they're here, they're here. And he pushed through this bit of vegetation. And there was this extraordinary scene. And there was the silverback. And honestly, it looked like someone had put four gorillas together in one creature. I've never seen, it was King Kong. It was the most enormous animal I have ever seen. Literally couldn't give a shit that we were there. Completely ignored us. I mean, just it was lying on its back. Just, he just lay there. And actually that particular group was mainly males. And there were some youngsters, and there were some that were incredibly curious. And as you know, when you're anywhere near any primate, gorillas, chimps, you wear masks because our diseases can be transferred to them. You have a limited time with them, just an hour, and it's on their terms, of course. Oh my goodness, that hour. It was, and just to watch the interactions, and it's really difficult to not anthropomorphize. It's really difficult not to see the human traits in them, and it was just this magical hour. And one of the things that I think I love about being in the presence of wildlife, particularly something like, animals like that have been. It takes 7 years to habituate a gorilla to not charge through the bush and rip you apart.
Mm-hmm.
And that was thanks again to those rangers and trackers who have done that. And they've done it not actually for tourism benefit, but for the benefit of the conservation of those animals. And there are 12 groups of eastern lowland gorillas throughout Kahuzi-Bahega. Only 3 of them are habituated enough for tourists to see them. The rest are habituated enough for expert rangers to be able to keep an eye on them. But to be in their presence and for them to basically just ignore us, I mean, that is what's so wonderful. So you're absolutely seeing them in the way that, they just behave. And what was so wonderful was just at the end of our hour, it started to rain. And clearly, eastern lowland gorillas don't like getting their hair wet. No, so they all got off and marched off, and that was it. You've had your time, we're off. And it was an incredible, right up there with, well, probably any wildlife experience I've had, but that would be right up there with one of the finest.
I think it's so good, and you're so right to mention the rangers. I think that thin green line, people on the men and women on the front, is so important to wildlife and nature in so many different places. I'm loving this conversation. We can go on and on and on, and I'd love to monopolize your time. But can I ask a couple of quick fire questions then, before we wind up? One is the environments we've talked about are all fairly challenging, whether it be Afghanistan, Yemen, Congo. Is that something you thrive upon? Do you like that challenge? Do you like taking yourself out of your comfort zone?
I don't like people much. It's a terrible thing to say. Well, I do like people. Of course, I like people. But
you talked about the kindness of strangers in different places.
I absolutely, but I don't want to go where everyone else is. I like being off the beaten track. And actually, you can be off the beaten track in places that you think you can't. There are plenty of places in Europe, in the UK. I live in a kind of tourist hotspot, but I know that I can walk out of my door and not see anybody just because I'm not doing the routes that everybody else is doing. But I love an underdog. So I love a country that, or a place or a region that people think they can't go. And I'm going to get myself into all sorts of trouble now, but I get infuriated by, Foreign Office advice. You can't travel here. And, they've put red all over a map. And I shouldn't, according to the Foreign Office, I shouldn't have gone to the Congo. I shouldn't have gone to Afghanistan. I shouldn't have gone to Mali. There's all sorts of places I shouldn't have gone to. And the problem is that sort of advice, we understand why it's there, but it means that some countries, whole countries get written off where there might only be one part of it that is actually dangerous. I am not a great believer in, oh, let's go somewhere dangerous for the sake of it. Absolutely
Uh,
not. But let's also not write off places that shouldn't be written off and whose people are going to be suffering because their main income comes from visitors. And if visitors are stopped from going there unnecessarily, then, then I just think break the rules and go.
well, I think very well said. Apart from breaking the rules, maybe necessarily, but I agree with you about blanket bans, etc. And we do take clients to places where there is sometimes negative FCDO advice. We're not cavalier with their safety in any way. We take expert advice on the ground, etc. But I agree with you that you often go to these places and it's any trouble or whatever is very regionalized or localized in different ways.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
where next for you? Have you got plans, or are you happy to
Well,
divulge them in terms of,
immediately next is Shetland,
okay,
a
you hope,
place that
depending
I
on,
hope,
yeah,
yes, yes, the wind might have other ideas, but I've been to Shetland a lot. It's a very, very special part of the UK. And there is this extraordinary Viking-inspired festival called Up Heliar, which is held at the end of January in Lerwick. So each island has its own one, but the main island and the main town on the island, Lerwick, have their Up Heliar in
there've been
January.
lots of people there.
There will be lots of people there,
Yeah,
but it's very special. It's a
legend.
very, very special event. So I'm actually taking a group to see that, and I'll be back there again in May. I'm doing quite a lot of trips this year, but as I say, the thing that I'm working on, which isn't set in stone yet, but yeah, the snow leopards are calling, Justin.
Okay, that's cool. So that's the one wildlife experience that you'd love to do, the snow leopard, or is there,
There,
or
oh no, there are loads. There
there
are
are
loads.
lots?
I mean, one day I will get to South Georgia. That's
Okay,
where I would
okay.
really love to go. And I would love
The
what I
the king
did
penguin
re
colonies and the elephant seals,
just
etc. So
but just the whole, yeah, I think the whole the history of it, the natural history of it.
yeah,
I always thought we laughed when I was doing Spring Watch that and programs like Love Island and stuff were starting, and I said I want to do the real Love Island, and I want to be on South Georgia, at mating season with all those incredible species, and yeah,
and the
that's
noise of
that
it, yeah.
that's the Love Island I'd watch.
Okay, again, we need to speak about that then. So, and we
Okay.
haven't talked about oceans at all in a different way. There is so much that I'd love to talk to you about. I've always loved your smile, your energy, your enthusiasm, and I just want to say it's a privilege to talk to you, and thank you so much for your time, and thank you very much, Kate.
I've
Um,
well, I've loved it. I can, as you know, I think us travelers who love traveling, we can talk about it forever.
yeah, well, Kate, thank you, and thank you to all of you for listening. I think in a couple of weeks' time, on February the 4th, I'm speaking to Sophie Ibbotson, who's a Central Asian expert. You're a hard act to follow, Kate. I don't know how she's
Well,
going to
I
do that,
don't
but
know. I think
yeah.
I'll definitely be tuning in for Sophie.
Well,
So
yes, then we can talk snow leopards again with her about in Central
indeed,
Asia as well. So there you are.
indeed,
So,
brilliant.
Kate, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take
It was
care.
an absolute pleasure,
Bye.
and thank you to everyone who tuned in as well. Have a good evening.